That's some great lights.
Hey everybody. Hey. How are we feeling? Good. Yeah? Let's get some applause. Let's go. That was a great panel. Guys, well, super excited to have this conversation on cosmic Bitcoin mining. This is going to be a really good one. These guys up here are some of the most brilliant minds I've ever talked to. Really excited to get the conversation going, but let's start with some introductions. Jesse, you want to go first?
I'm Jesse Peltan, CTO of Huddle Ranch for a West Texas mining company.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone. Co-founder of Aptopool. I started my Bitcoin in 2011. And actually, before I started mining Bitcoin, I was a contributor sitting at home. One day I get to know Bitcoin, and I recognized by mining Bitcoin, and I can actually not just contribution to projects, but also getting paid. So I immediately convert my sitting at home setup into Bitcoin mining setup. So that's how I got started.
SETI.
Awesome.
I didn't know that about your history. SETI at home was always my favorite screensaver growing up. My name's Drew Vansel. I'm one of the co-founders at Unchained Capital. We do multi-sig Bitcoin custody and financial services for long-term holders of Bitcoin. And I've also written and thought a lot about Bitcoin in space, and I can't believe there's an entire group of us that are excited about these things. So thanks for coming, everybody.
All right, so we're gonna start with like the softball, normal kind of stuff to talk about, and then gradually just get more and more weird. So let's start with a question. Let's do a 5-year, 10-year, 100-year lens on where and how we will be mining Bitcoin. Jesse?
So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be at 10x the size of where Bitcoin is today. So I think we're going to be on the order of 1 to 200 gigawatts. So right now today we're roughly 0.1% of global energy consumption. I think that'll get up to about 1%. But I think what's really exciting about Bitcoin is Bitcoin's ability to catalyze new energy innovations that will increase total global energy consumption using newer technologies, new processes, and long term that'll allow for significantly more growth.
Yeah. So I was in Antarctica. Actually, I visited the South Pole in December last year. So I see a lot of infrastructures, airport over there, never mapped on any public maps. So, but life is quite hard there. I spent in total 1 week there. One of the reasons why life is hard because there's no strong electricity supply, and people still like burning oil and generators. But just to consider if we can bring a Bitcoin mining farm, you just need a fraction of the Bitcoin mining farm output, and you can supply a whole research station, airport, all the infrastructures. So maybe that will happen in the next 5 or 10 years. I hope so, and that's also because Bitcoin is decentralized, becomes neutral, becomes it's about belong to everyone. It's kind of borderless, and if we can generate a fraction of Bitcoin from somewhere it not belong to any countries, I think that also represent Bitcoin's value. So I kind of hope that will happen in the next 5 or 10 years.
Awesome.
I think I definitely agree with Jesse that on the order of years, like single-digit years, 5, 10 years or so, we should see huge growth in Bitcoin mining. I agree we're at like 0.1%, and I see that going to 1% easily. I might also, you had asked about where. I'd love to believe increasingly it's America, and we're not seeding, or perhaps even all countries. That it's not that there's necessarily one giant superpower of mining, but that it's more spread out. But that starts with, of course, doing it here at home. I think on the order of decades, we get to maybe 10% of world energy consumption is being used in proof of work mining. And I think we eventually saturate some kind of bound there in terms of percentages. I've conjectured this in the past, this idea of like the Nakamoto point, just the notion that marginal revenues for selling energy to consumers should equal, on a kilowatt hour basis, marginal revenues from Bitcoin mining. That's not true today. Bitcoin mining is fantastically more profitable if you're an energy producer. But again, Bitcoin is so small that the sizes don't match. I think as Bitcoin becomes larger, it's much more realistic that energy production and Bitcoin mining are the same industry, not different industries, and that we'll saturate this kind of bound. On the hundreds of years time scales, yeah, I think we're going to Mars, and I think we're mining something on Mars and maybe the moon, as we were just discussing earlier.
I think there's an interesting point of, where is this going to take place? I think we're already seeing this take place in Texas. So Texas is an open free market structure. It allows for a lot of permissionless innovation. So you're seeing a lot of energy generation happen in Texas, a lot of Bitcoin mining happen in Texas. I hope that other countries will eventually copy that model because they'll see around the ability to reduce costs, the ability to increase utilization of renewables. And if you look at Texas, Texas is actually also very blessed when it comes to renewable resources. So it's the only place in the US where you see the wind corridor, which goes from West Texas north to Canada, and the sun belt going from Southern California to West Texas intersecting. So you have this geographic area with complementary production profiles. So it's really unique from a resource standpoint, and that's incredibly important when you look to scale energy consumption 10, 100 times from where we are today. Nuclear is another way that we can potentially scale. But there are a few geographic regions on the planet that have these sorts of convergent resources, and I think Texas will be that lead model, and then you'll see that replicated in other areas. And I hope that other countries will adopt these more open regulatory frameworks, because otherwise we will have a centralization problem in Texas.
And also, 5 to 10% you mentioned is just a starting point. Bitcoin has any impact on electricity infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And keep in mind that 10% of electricity doesn't equal to 10% of energy. Electricity generation is a fractional of total energy consumption of our society and our world. So, and which is further like a fractional of the world GDP. So I think even like we have someday we see that 10% of electricity used for Bitcoin mining. That's I must say that's not the end of world. That's a starting like Bitcoin would have some impact or could help the global electricity power grid. And Bitcoin can be used for like something like virtual load balancer. Like if you mine Bitcoin, one Bitcoin over here, then someone else must mine one less Bitcoin over there. So if you mine one Bitcoin, such like in the middle of the ocean, Pacific, then there must be using clean energy. There must be some, some people else virtually like maybe use less, traditional energy to mine one Bitcoin from elsewhere. So I think this kind of nothing else can do this like in virtual and such efficient way.
I think there's two interesting points to touch on here. So one is the world is evolving towards electrification. So electricity is this amazingly ordered, low entropy energy source that you can use for anything. And increasingly, newer generation technologies of whether that's nuclear or solar or wind, they're producing electricity. So I think we're going to see a fundamental shift where electricity today is on the order of about 10% of total energy consumption. That's going to grow significantly as we shift our energy balance away from traditional fossil fuels as we're growing total human energy consumption. Then the other point on Bitcoin as a load balancer is a really interesting one because the fundamental new incentive that Bitcoin introduces into the energy market that wasn't there before is the fact that Bitcoin is relatively time and location independent. So most loads, most types of energy consumption require energy consumption in one specific location at one specific time. So for example, if you have a hospital and you're getting a heart surgery and they need power for it, it doesn't help you if they give you power 2 hours after you need it. The value is incredibly high at one point and very low even a few minutes later. But with Bitcoin, you have this much greater stability in terms of value across time or across space, where you can locate a Bitcoin mine in any position, and you don't have the same sorts of uptime requirements or the same sorts of location siting needs as other types of loads. And in the long term, that's actually going to be a catalyst for those other types of loads. So for example, like West Texas right now, there's not a ton of industry other than the oil and gas industry, but there's a lot of Bitcoin mining going in today. And as that Bitcoin mining grows, there will be an entire ecosystem built out around that, and that'll enable other types of large energy consumption. So like primary metals production, manufacturing, more traditional types of industry, and that's what's gonna help shift the global industry away from our traditional energy sources to using the energy sources that we have available. Because the problem isn't generating these sources at a low enough cost. The problem with renewables is that renewables produce energy at times and in places that aren't useful to us. So the challenge over the next century is going to be making those useful, and Bitcoin is one of the best catalysts to start that change.
I want to follow up on something that you're saying there. I think you mean this, but it perhaps deserves to be said loudly. That's not something that's just going to happen in West Texas, right? That we're going to see this notion of energy, like location independence, and the ability to locate Bitcoin mining facilities around the planet in places where energy happens to be abundant, but where there aren't necessarily people or raw materials or manufacturing centers or markets that can use that energy. And to your point, I think what we're seeing is potentially a de-urbanization over time, that instead of having to be near everyone else in order to make industry work, we can, as you say, like develop whole new areas where people aren't really settling yet. And hopefully that makes, house prices lower in Austin where I live. And I think that's a really cool thing, because I worry about a constant upward trend of just everybody moving to cities and the logistical problems that occur with global supply chains for energy. I mean, my car uses gas that was, probably mined somewhere around the planet and shipped around a whole bunch of times. That's very wasteful as compared to being able to use energy, raw materials, things that are sourced from right where I'm at. But we didn't build the world's supply chain that way. This is a chance to rebuild it on more distributed terms.
And I think there's a really interesting global human narrative of the history of human civilization that ties in here. If even today, a double-digit percentage of people live within 100 kilometers of the coastline. And that's because historically in human civilizations, coasts were incredibly beneficial for trade, for fishing, et cetera. And I think this century, you're going to start to see a lot of settlement and development around areas that have the highest density of energy resources, because fundamentally we're going to be producing more high energy intensity manufactured goods, and that's going to require a redistribution of civilization around a different type of resource, and that's going to make long-lasting changes to the way that the globe is laid out and that civilization is structured.
I don't even have to do my job. I mean, look at this. So the conversation is already starting to touch a few places that I wanted to dig into. One of them being, how would you look at Bitcoin from a historical lens of industrial revolutions? Do you see Bitcoin mining as being the catalyst for a new industrial revolution? And if so, what does that revolution look like? We've started to talk about, some of the reordering of society, but what about the reordering of industry?
Absolutely. I think, the reason why I'm in Bitcoin today is because my life's goal is to get us to type 1 civilization. So for those who aren't aware, type 1 civilization is when a species has mastery over all of the energy flows on its planet. So Bitcoin is a catalyst that's going to enable us to develop other energy technologies, and today, globally, we're consuming about 20,000 gigawatts of energy. So that's total primary energy consumption. The thermodynamic limit is about 120 million gigawatts, so 6,000 times larger. So if you think 6,000 times more energy consumption than we have today, and that will fundamentally transform everything that we do. So if you think of prehistoric humanity, the average person on the planet today consumes about 10 times as much energy as somebody from 10,000 years ago. And going into the future, we see 3 orders of magnitude. So that same sort of change, again, 3 times. So we can't even imagine what all of that energy will be used for, but we will find uses for it. If you asked a caveman 10,000 years ago, what would you do with 10 times as much energy? They might have come up with, I'll have food all the time, I might be warm all the time, but they're not going to come up with airplanes and digital electronics and everything else that comes with it. And Bitcoin is a really interesting catalyst for this because of those differentiated economic factors. But this also touches on the point about the shift from these thermal energy sources to electrical energy. And as we shift towards electrical energy, we can redesign all sorts of chemical processes, primary metals processes that are done today in a certain way that can be done very differently. So for example, if you look at the production of concrete, concrete's one of the biggest sources of CO2 on the planet. This is from 2 sources. So one, the decomposition of your limestone when you're heating it up. It gives off carbon dioxide, and 2, the burning of coal when you're burning it. And the problem is that today it's very difficult to capture that because it's this very low density stream of carbon dioxide. But if you had an electrically powered system, then you have a pure stream of CO2 that comes off, and you can capture that easily and utilize it for something else. So that will fundamentally change the way that we do concrete. There's similar sorts of shifts in things like steel production, other types of primary metals, metals refining, so even things like being able to refine metals in an inert atmosphere, it's a lot easier if you're doing that using electricity than using thermal sources. And that is going to have ripple effects through every single sector of the world. Like think of if steel was 1/10 the cost of it that it is today. I mean, just look at the Industrial Revolution, how steel changed everything. Before steel, we couldn't have cars, we couldn't have bridges, we couldn't have, I mean, not like large ones. We couldn't have, the types of skyscrapers we have today. So if we can lower the cost of all these goods, that'll lower the cost of high density housing, that'll lower the cost of transportation, it will improve life vastly for the average person on the planet.
Let's even toss out a super simple example is water scarcity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like right now, water is scarce in the world and it's becoming increasingly more scarce, but that's not a resource problem, it's an energy problem. Because it's the thing that limits us is our ability to harness energy to desalinate water using electrolysis. And so if suddenly energy is massively more abundant and overproduced, we've solved the water problem.
No,
this is really important.
There was this Nobel Prize winning chemist, Richard Smalley, who had a list of the top 10 problems facing humanity in the 21st century. And what's really interesting about this list is that it's hierarchical. So this was really inspirational for me. The number one thing on this list is energy. Because with energy, you can solve all of the other problems. And number 2 is water. So as Drew mentioned, if you have energy, you can make water. It's 1 kilowatt hour per meter cubed is the fundamental limit of how much energy it takes to desalinate water. We have reverse osmosis, technologies that get relatively close to that. And if you have water and you have energy, you can have unlimited food production because you can make fertilizer. If you have energy, you can make fertilizer. You can mine phosphorus, potassium. You can create nitrogen-based fertilizers. As you have energy and water and you have food, then you can solve poverty. You can solve education. You can solve all of these other things that are sort of built on this resource scarcity. And this ties it back to Bitcoin, that Bitcoin can be this catalyst for this electric revolution, where the next industrial revolution is going to be based on this highly ordered, low entropy energy source, which is electricity, because it changes the game in terms of what we can do with that energy and the types of processes that are possible. So we're going to see chemical processes throughout industry, metals processes, all of that redefined when we have this shift towards electrical energy.
I always have a dream to living in the middle of a Pacific Ocean. Seems like we have water, electricity. Yeah, so everything is ready. So that's will shift, the global population. And 71% of the Earth is covered by water and covered by ocean. We'll have a lot more space for human beings to live and to work. So I think we probably see a human landing on Mars pretty sooner than a lot of people ever imagined. So if we after let's say 20 years, when we look back, what actually bring us to another planet, it's not because we have a powerful rocket. You see, today's airplane compared to 50 years ago, the airplanes are actually flying almost same speed. I think tomorrow's rocket probably not necessarily a lot more powerful because of the basic physics and the chemical restrictions. But if you look back, what seriously changed in the past few decades, that's actually the internet, IT, computer technologies. Why today we can land a rocket vertically in the middle of the ocean, but 50 years ago we couldn't? That's because we have better computers, we have better algorithms, we have better programmers. And so if we look ahead, it's probably something very differently, we never imagined ever before to reshape our civilization. Such Bitcoin has this potential to do something, to make our civilization to the next level.
So I want to hit on that right now, actually. We mentioned the Kardashev scale before. We mentioned about getting to phase 1, right? The first stage of the Kardashev scale. Could Bitcoin also move us to a second stage along that scale? Dhruv, I want to hear from you. If we start talking about the moon and Mars, tell us about Bitcoin and how good of a tool it is to get us there.
I had a brief exchange with Jun just backstage, so I'm going to be really curious for his follow-up comments right after this. But in the thinking that I've done, I kind of proceeded along the following kind of train of thoughts, which was, number one, Bitcoin, everything we've been talking about, is happening here on the surface of the Earth. The Earth is small when we get to like universal scales. It's a light second wide or something like that. Its information can cross the Earth very quickly.
It's 0.1.
0.1, sorry, I'm off by order. Chin's on me, man, I love it. Point is, I mean, the internet's existence is proof that we can send information around the planet very quickly. As we get into space, distances become tremendously large, and this causes time scales to elongate, and it causes energy scales to increase, just generically for everything that happens in space that you might imagine from science fiction or whatever. As Bitcoin starts to be used in space, which will totally work. We can go to Mars and we can hold Bitcoin, and as long as we have private keys and we can send signals back to Earth, we can use Bitcoin on Mars or anywhere else. The challenge, and I've written about this in a phrase that I've called the hash horizon, it's just the idea that mining, unfortunately, I don't think will work far away from Earth. For reasons of consensus, and there's some technical things and you can figure it out. Point is, I think mining can only exist relatively near to the Earth because that's where mining exists now. And a miner who goes to Mars and tries to mine will find that they don't actually win blocks, almost no matter how much energy they bring to bear. And that kind of forces us to consider the idea that even if Bitcoin can be used elsewhere, Bitcoin mining may not be possible elsewhere. And we've just spent 15 minutes talking about how incredibly important Bitcoin mining is. Proof of work mining unlocks all these incentives which optimize and create overabundance in our energy supply chains. So in the future, 100 years from now, when we have colonized Mars, or we're beginning to do so, we'll understand this in a way that we don't understand it now. Or maybe only Jesse understands it now.
This is actually the biggest concern of mine, like Bitcoin one day this will fail. Because, on the day like human become multiplanetary and we have a kind of a few thousand people living on Mars, they'll have they need some fundamental things every day like we need, such as they need an iPhone. And consider like probably for quite a long time, like people on Mars and Mars industry probably not on the level like match with the Earth. Probably we'll see quite some time human cannot manufacture, cannot develop a new generation of iPhone or any electronics right on Mars. They probably have to wait for like newer generations of iPhones to deliver from the Earth. And the window is only every 26 months. And consider like, I think the future, for future Martians, the biggest festival for Earth is New Year, is Christmas. But for future Martians, the biggest festival for them is probably not New Year of Mars. It's every 26 months when the new wave of immigration is coming from Earth to Mars. They deliver not just water, food, and necessities, but they deliver them new generations of iPhone. Unfortunately, yeah. So unfortunately, when the Martians receive a new generation iPhone, without Apple set up data centers, set up servers on Mars, they couldn't even activate their iPhone. They couldn't use it. There's no Google. Google must set up servers on Mars. They cannot set up an alarm to wake them up in the morning because iPhone doesn't support Martian time zones. And Google Calendar must also support Martian time zones. I tried to live in Martian time zones back in Svalbard because there's 24 hours daytime. But I couldn't because it's not possible to set up my calendar. And so basically every single software fundamentally inside underlying in the OS have to change, have to match it up. We probably still use UTC, but Martians, they need a totally new set of operating system features. Consider Bitcoin. Bitcoin is also software. If Bitcoin cannot change this, let's say Google. If Google do not set up servers on Mars, they're out of market. Once probably not when Mars have 1,000 people. But consider if one day Mars have 1 million people, they're out of market. But Bitcoin, we all know the debate, like multi-years on scaling Bitcoin. That actually, I don't have the confidence like Bitcoin can make such a serious change. It's not ideal like only people on the Earth who has the, who can mine Bitcoin. Bitcoin should belong to everyone, regardless which planet they live in. So how to change Bitcoin, how to make Bitcoin like, for this kind of usage scenarios, how to make Bitcoin to keep us the development of our civilization. That's I think the lesson we need to answer over the next few decades.
So I actually want to jump in on this a little bit and help explain. For people who haven't read Dhruv work, who haven't thought about the hash horizon, to break it down a little bit, the idea is that when you mine a block, that block gets propagated to the network, and the next block uses that block in order to mine the next one, right? That's how the blockchain works. Well, if you're on Mars, it takes light how long? It takes information how long to travel from Earth to Mars?
Sometimes up to 20 to 40 minutes.
So if you're waiting 20 minutes longer than Earth nodes to receive the next block, you are at a 20-minute disadvantage to mine the next block. And so you can have these weird desynchronizations that happen if you have a whole bunch of hash power in one place and you're trying to mine in another place. And so one question that I would pose back, and maybe I'll pose it to you, Jesse, if you want, or Dhruv, or Chun, is do we need to soft fork, or do we need to change the consensus mechanism to change the block time? And would this solve our problem that we're talking about?
So I want to make 2 points on this. So I agree with Dhruv that this is a huge problem with mining beyond the Earth. I think you can go to the moon. The moon is about 1 1/3 light seconds away. That's not far enough to significantly impact your block times there. That's a little bit of latency, but not crazy. As you start to get out farther, Mars, you might be able to augment it to, you could potentially fork Bitcoin in order to accommodate that hash horizon. But as you go out farther and farther, it becomes quickly impractical to do so. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to do so, and I don't think that it's necessary for the Kardashev scaling that we want. So what's interesting about Bitcoin, so from an incentive perspective, right, Bitcoin is the leading type of compute that has this differentiated incentive, but it's not the only type. It's a subset of latency insensitive parallel processing. So this could also be machine learning, any sort of large data models, anything that are these large parallel models that don't have to be done immediately, that might take weeks to do. If it takes weeks to do, then a few minutes of latency is not a big deal. And I think in the long term, where we're going to see the development of energy on other planets, on the moon, potentially even a Dyson swarm, is going to be for other types of highly parallelizable processing. And for example, one of the interesting pieces here is in the long-term sort of evolution of humanity, the human brain is a 20-watt computer. And we don't have super efficient computers today, but we're getting more efficient all the time, more efficient structures. But if you look at the Earth's fundamental thermodynamic limit just for the Earth, right, we might be able to get to about 10% of type 1 civilization. We can't really get all the way there without destroying the biosphere, which is irreplaceable. But that would be on the order of about 10 million gigawatts. So if you have 10 billion people, 10 million gigawatts, that's about, you're talking about a scale of megawatts per person in terms of cognitive offloading or cognitive augmentation versus 20 watts today. So 100,000 times more potential power that you could augment. And we cannot even begin to imagine how that will change our lives. I mean, you can think of VR, AR, stuff like that. But the types of ways that we can augment human thought processes, human experience, cognition, using computing, we are just beginning to explore that realm. And as you get beyond the limits of the Earth and you look at things like going to the moon, so that the fundamental limitation on how much energy we can use on the Earth is about heat. It's not about any specific energy source. That it doesn't matter if we had unlimited fusion power, you'd still run into the problem of there's a certain amount of heat that the Earth will emit for a given temperature. So black body radiation is governed by the fourth power of the temperature of the object. So as you go up, the amount of energy you're giving off increases, but as you increase the amount of energy density on the planet, the temperature is going to rise necessarily. So there is a fundamental thermodynamic limit of how much energy we can use on the planet. But even something like the moon, which only has about 1/10 the surface area, because you don't have the same sensitivity of the biosphere, you could potentially do significantly more industry. We could more than double the amount of industry that we can do by moving to something like the moon or Mars. Once you start getting to the scale of type 2 civilization, the scales get crazy, because instead of talking about 3 orders of magnitude increase in power consumption, now we're talking about 10 orders of magnitude, which is like incomprehensibly large. I can't even imagine how we would use that for cognitive augmentation. And then you also start getting into all sorts of problems of a Dyson sphere. I'm pretty out on that idea just from a structural standpoint. A Dyson swarm potentially, but then maintaining trillions of different satellites that all have production on them and then have to radiate heat out to the vacuum of space. That technology is so far and so beyond us that I don't think we can even begin to really realistically talk about that. But I do think that type 1 civilization is within reach for humanity, that we can get to the point where we can harness the energy sources that exist to us on the planet. And the growth in energy sources, we can't scale fossil fuels 1,000x. We can scale solar, we can scale wind, and we can scale nuclear. But those are basically the energy sources that we have available to us. And through Bitcoin and other types of highly parallelizable, latency-insensitive compute, we're going to be able to continue to utilize and grow our utilization of those resources. And that is going to fundamentally improve life for everybody on the planet. If you look at human poverty or prosperity, the best correlation is access to affordable, reliable energy. So the more affordable, reliable energy we can produce on the planet, the better it will be for all of humanity.
And mathematically, say a latency-torrented blockchain is possible. But the question is, Bitcoin is not that kind of. Is it possible to make Bitcoin, transit into like latency-torrented with a soft fork? I think it's possible, because any feature can be introduced by soft fork. But I think that soft fork probably will be super ugly. So it probably will need a hard fork or something. There's also another possibility, like each planet at least they have a local blockchain, and I think maybe in the future the Earth people they running their own local blockchain. Martian people they have run their own local blockchain, and there's a much bigger blockchain which is latency torrented. Will be used for interplanetary settlement. But Bitcoin is not just the first blockchain, it's also the most neutral blockchain, and accepted by everyone, not just the Earth, but also Mars. So I do hope like it's Bitcoin to take the role of an interplanetary settlement rather than an altcoin to take this role. So I think that's like, make this, the transition, how to make the transition from for Bitcoin to a latency torrented model is, I don't hope to like see what happened to the scaling a few years ago, like, they're struggling and cannot make any decisions. And I do think by that time, I do hope by that time we'll have a better government model to make a decision how to actually make Bitcoin to do this kind of transition.
I think you're raising some really interesting questions. Let's put it bluntly. The people of Earth in the future, will they decide because they want Bitcoin mining to happen on Mars as well, that they should increase the block time to make Mars now fall within the hash horizon? That's a choice that they could make. And I think you're discussing, would they do it through a soft fork, the governance issues. I think Jesse raised a good point that even if they did, well, what will happen when we get to Jupiter? What will happen when we get to the Kuiper Belt, and not to mention other star systems? I think there's even a third issue, which is the longer we make the block time, the slower and more ponderous everything built on top of Bitcoin that's happening right here on Earth becomes. Lightning Network becomes slower because now we're waiting much longer for channel creations. And if we're expected to be able to have our hash horizon encompass the whole solar system, we're talking about block times of days, weeks.
I think rather than do this way, it's possible to like make multiple chains, the sparse
Yes,
community structure.
yes, and that's the vision that I definitely hold. Is what will inevitably occur, in my view, is Earthers will not make this choice. They will say, let's preserve Bitcoin in the way that it currently is, and Martians and
In
everywhere
that
else
case,
that we go
Bitcoin
will.
will be like a local only Bitcoin.
Yes, like a planetary blockchain,
Yeah.
and Mars will get one, and it'll be much. And I actually think that's interesting for even another reason, which is I think it's an economic incentive to go and settle those places. Like the reason you can't just build another Bitcoin today on Earth is because it doesn't do anything that Bitcoin already doesn't do, right? There's no point in doing it. There's no point in many of the
So you have
altcoins
to,
that are out there right
you
now.
have to make a shitcoin.
Right. But what makes a version of Bitcoin running on Mars not a shitcoin? It has one property that Bitcoin can never have, which is that most of its miners are on Mars. That's fundamentally just a new idea. And so it can justify the incentives to go out and settle Mars, if only because then I'll get to be one of the first people to have Martian Bitcoin. And then when that becomes too saturated, the people will want to move to Jupiter so that they can start that blockchain. And I think it's really interesting to create economic incentives that directly cause us to want to settle like the rest of the solar system, as compared to just relying on rich people's sense of adventure. Yeah. I don't think that's a scalable way for humanity to become a multiplanetary species. We need to embed economic incentives into it.
So, yeah. So, Dhruv, I want to throw this back to you with kind of a question, and it's going to be the last question before kind of final words, which is, some of this seems like it is a property that is almost like a truth of information, flowing around the universe, right? It seems like, in a way, Bitcoin was discovered more than it was invented. And I want to hear two things. Do you think that that'd be accurate? And then number two, if there is life elsewhere, what is the sign of that life that we should be looking for? Might there be settlement out there of a consensus variety that we should be searching for?
I'll try to go fast. Let's start with the life thing, just because I think it's going to take us way too long if we don't talk about it. I think the reason that I think Bitcoin can be rightly said to have been discovered is I think Jesse made an interesting claim that everything is discovered and nothing is invented, which I like. But Bitcoin seems to have a shape and a pattern that is not arbitrary. Some things about it are arbitrary, like it's exactly 10 minutes, 216,000 blocks, this particular hashing algorithm. But the overall shape of how the pieces connect and the incentives they create seems to be a wonderful thing that we've discovered. And we originally created it because we wanted a better kind of money. And now we're learning that it actually changes our energy supply chains. Maybe it creates new kinds of telecommunications networks and logistical and transport networks. It maybe, I'm arguing, causes us to create incentives to become an interplanetary species, which preserves us against all sorts of disasters that killed off our reptilian forebears. These are amazing properties for a thing to have. And it makes me believe that, like other fundamental technologies, computing, fusion, all sorts of other, this is a necessary thing, that all species will inevitably discover something like their version of Bitcoin, and it'll pretty much work in the same way. Again, the details might be different, but the shape will be the same. And that's a powerful idea, because then it leads to, of course, the question, like, do aliens have Bitcoin? And if so, like, when we see them, when they detect us, when we start communicating, SETI or whatever else it is, how will that communication unfold? And increasingly, yes, I do believe that they'll be sending us block headers. And it's because they want us to join their blockchains. They want to show to us their proof of work. They want to prove their own position on the Kardashev scale. And it's an open invitation. Anybody who gets, Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer network, and perhaps what an interstellar or intergalactic even civilization is just an economic network of people agreeing to use a protocol to exchange value, information, and energy over tremendous scales.
Are you sure they will send you Bitcoin block headers?
I think
Not Dogecoin?
Not Dogecoin. Dogecoin is from space. Yeah, that's the last thing we need people to think.
So if it defined Bitcoin as a UTXO blockchain that have a block time of 10 minutes, they probably invented. But I think blockchain probably was discovered.
Maybe their blockchain has a block time of 50 years.
Yeah.
So it allows us to actually mine together on the same chain.
Guys, we could go on for another 50 years on this, but we're out of time. Really quick, where can everybody find you? Give a quick sign off. Jesse, please start.
You can find me on Twitter, Jesse Pelton. Feel free to reach out to me publicly or privately. I love all these ideas, happy to discuss them. I think energy, Bitcoin, space, it's all fascinating. So, or feel free to come up to me after the panel and happy to chat.
My Twitter handle is Satofishi, Satofishi.
Yes.
Yes.
I am just Drew Bansel on Twitter. You can find me tweeting there very occasionally these random things. I blog a lot on Unchained's blog. That's where I tend to publish my crazier ideas. And I'll be at the booth that Unchained has just in that booth area. So please come by and say hello.
All right, and I'm Brand BTC on Twitter. I'm Brandon. I work for Bitcoin Magazine and BTC Inc. So give it up for this panel.